Good morning. I'm Mitch Horniker. I'm the chair of the Portland Business Alliance and executive vice president at Howard S. Wright. Obviously, we're here today, and you're all here today because we got a fantastic forum on homelessness. But we thought with the tragedies in Paris, in North Africa, and in Central Africa, we ought to start today with a moment of silence. Okay. Today we're joined by Lloyd Pendleton with the nationally recognized Housing First program from Salt Lake City. He's going to talk to us today about Salt Lake's successful plan to end homelessness, focusing on chronic homelessness, and how it has changed the lives of many of his community's most needy, and also improve the livability and business climate in this city. As almost all of you know, this past summer, Portlanders became increasingly concerned about our growing homeless population throughout the city, not just in downtown, but throughout the inner east side and out into the outer confines of the city. The Alliance has led a public advocacy campaign to spur action on this issue. Our focus has been safer and more humane solutions for the homeless population and tools to ensure that our public spaces, our parks, and our open spaces are livable and safe for everyone. As part of our campaign, we launched an online petition that now has over 3,300 signatures on it, all focused on finding the right path forward. In September, Mayor Hales declared a one-year state of housing emergency, and Mayor Hales has also joined with Chair Kafoury to dedicate $30 million to this issue, 20 from the city and 10 from the county. They're also addressing, they're using the money to, we're just starting to figure out how we're going to use the money. I should probably say it that way, which is a good thing. And that's part of the reasons why we asked Lloyd to come today. At the Alliance, we maintain our belief that we need to get more people into shelters, we need to increase services for the mentally ill, and we need to enforce our existing laws to prevent illegal behaviors that threaten our city's livability. And this is something I think is lost on a lot of people, those illegal behaviors in a large extent are preying on the most vulnerable in the city, including the homeless. We hope that our discussion today moves us forward. So now I'd like to take a minute to recognize our sponsors. We have 3 series sponsors: Pamplin Media Group, which includes Portland Tribune, community newspapers, and AM 860 KPAM radio. The Portland Tribune publishes news daily online at portlandtribune.com and is available at newsstands on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Community Newspapers produces 24 newspapers throughout the state. In print, online, and on the air, Pamplin reaches more than 1 million people each week. Joining us as usual is the president and publisher, Mark Garber. Our next series sponsor is Liberty Mutual, the largest regional commercial property and casualty insurer in the Northwest, with a focus on strong partnerships. Liberty has been creating insurance solutions and providing superior services for businesses in the Northwest since 1923. And our final series sponsor is KeyBank. Key operates 80 branches in Oregon and Southwest Washington, one of the nation's largest bank-based financial services companies. Key provides deposit, lending, cash management, and investment services to individuals and small and mid-sized businesses in 12 states. Key also provides a broad range of sophisticated corporate and investment banking products, such as M&A, merger and acquisition advice, public and private debt and equity, syndications, derivatives, and all to middle market companies in selected industries throughout the United States. Joining us today, as always, is Barb Cardinale. Good morning, Barb. We're also lucky today to have several elected officials in the room from Oregon cities and counties. We're going to put them up on the board, I think. So rather than going down the list, we would like to thank them all for being here. And I think it just points out that we have awesome alignment, public-private alignment on the need and the crucial time that we're at looking at this homeless issue and what to do about it. I would like to point out, I'd just like to name one person, David Hauser, the president of the Eugene Chamber, has come up all the way from Eugene, has been a great partner with the Alliance, and we really appreciate that. Let's give everybody a hand. Okay, our main guest today, Lloyd Pendleton, joins us from Salt Lake. He came in last night, made it through the weather. Where he's been an advocate for the homeless for more than 11 years. In 2004, as a part-time loan executive, Lloyd took the lead in writing and implementing the state of Utah's 10-year plan for ending chronic homelessness. Lloyd then retired from that job and went on to work for the state of Utah as the director for the Homeless Task Force, basically implementing the plan. The 2004 plan sought to end chronic homelessness and reduce overall homelessness by 2015. As of January 2015, Utah has reduced its chronic homeless count by 91%. Yeah, pretty spectacular. Because of his work with Utah's homeless population and the agencies that serve them, he was awarded the 2009 Governor's Award of Excellence. Lloyd has also been previously loaned by the state of Utah to the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness for 6 months, where he worked with the Department of Justice trying to reduce homelessness for those coming out of incarceration, another chronic problem. Lloyd has now left the state of Utah employment and is speaking and consulting across the country and helping other communities learn from the Utah experience. Prior to his appointment with the state, Lloyd was in management with Ford Motor Company for 14 years and was originally a graduate from BYU, holds a bachelor's degree in political science and a master's in business administration. Please help me and welcome Lloyd Pendleton and Portland Business Alliance President and CEO Sandy McDonough, who will help guide today's conversation. And remember to join the online conversation today, if you are so inclined, at hashtag PBA events. Sandy and Lloyd.
Well, Lloyd, thank you so much for being here. You can see this is an issue that we have a huge amount of interest and concern about in our community, and particularly we have electeds from all over our region. So it's not just something that Portland cares about, and the mayor of Eugene, Kitty Percy, is here as well. It's an issue that all of our state is trying to grapple with. So we've seen what happened in Utah. Can you first just give us an overview of how did you get into this in the first place, and how did Utah accomplish, and Salt Lake accomplish, those phenomenal statistics we saw?
Well, I got involved, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. And before I answer that question, I just want to tell you thank you for who you are, for your interest in making your community a better community, and I appreciate that interest, and because it can't be done without individuals like you. I send you my love and appreciation, and for the opportunity to come and share some of the things that we've learned and able to do there in the Salt Lake City area. And the number of 91% is a statewide homeless reduction, not just Salt Lake City or Salt Lake County. It's a statewide 91% reduction in chronic homelessness. Also, we're going to have our 41 homeless veterans housed by December 15th as a target. We've got them tagged, identified, and we have beds. And so we plan to have all homeless veterans sheltered and housed by middle of next month. So
we're making great progress on that here too.
Right, and that's been very beneficial because the Veterans Affairs put in additional resources, so that made it much easier from that standpoint. So how did I get involved in this personally? I worked for the LDS Church for 26 years in the welfare department, and I was loaned out to a nonprofit that was struggling. There was a food bank, and they were basically going to go under, so I went on site, Spent several months there helping getting the board involved, turning them around, and now a very successful program. But it got me exposed to the nonprofit world, which, I mean, I drove by homeless people and I would say, you lazy bums, get a job and pull yourself up by the bootstraps. Because I was reared on a ranch and grew up with a high work ethic. And so I said those words, get a job, you lazy bums. And so I've had to go through a change in my whole attitude as I began to work with the homeless and get to know them. Then 3 years later, I got loaned out to the largest homeless shelter because they were struggling, and I spent a year on site helping turn them around. So that got me exposed to the nonprofit world and to the homeless world. Because I was in finance at Ford Motor Company and finance at the LDS Church and then running operations. So when the state took on the assignment, or the governor signed up the state to look at the 10-year planning process that the federal government had been putting in place back in 2003, 2002, 2003, under the Bush administration, I was invited to go to a 4-day training seminar in Chicago about this whole idea of housing first. And I had read a 10-year plan or two, and they had said they're going to end homelessness in 10 years. And I said, you guys are smoking something. There's no way in heck you're going to do something like that. So I went with kind of a biased attitude. After sitting through 4 days of hearing the research and hearing about housing first, and understanding what their target was, the chronic homeless population, because they're very expensive to the community. All those people out on the street that are sleeping out there are costing you probably $40,000 a year per person, $20,000 to $40,000 in emergency room visits, EMT runs, police, jail time, etc. You're already paying for them. It's just being absorbed in a lot of areas. So after spending 4 days and understanding what it is they were saying, flying out of Chicago, I can remember this, and I like aisle seats, not window seats. For some reason, I got a window seat flying back to Salt Lake. I can remember flying through the clouds, and I looked out at the clouds and says, Lloyd, if there's any state in the Union that can achieve this goal, it's the state of Utah. I personally became convinced that it could be done in the state of Utah. So we came back and started to write the 10-year plan. It wasn't coming together, and so a couple of the homeless service providers with whom I had worked when I'd been loaned out, they went to the governor and asked the leaders of my church if they would loan me out to work on this process. I told them I'd be willing to do it, but I wasn't going to ask. And so I got loaned out on a part-time basis to take the lead in writing the plan and start to implement it. So that's how I got involved in the homeless, because it wasn't something I grew up in. I came from the outside with a financial background, operation background, to come in to address an issue and figure out how can we make it happen.
So can you describe a bit about what the homeless population in Utah looked like? Here in Portland, we have chronic homeless. We have people who are temporarily homeless. We have a large group of mentally ill people who've been released from state hospitals with nowhere to go. And then we have a group that we call here the travelers, mostly relatively young people who come into town typically in the summer months when it's not raining as much, and frankly I think are the folks who generate the most complaints that we hear from people in the region about things that they see. Is that what you were seeing in Salt Lake as well?
Yes, our homeless population followed the national segmentation of the market. Dennis Culhane out of the University of Pennsylvania had done a major study during the late 1990s, published in early 2000, that basically looked at and determined that out of 100 homeless population, 10% would be chronically homeless. And he did a study and found that it was $38,000 per person per year on the street. He did a study of 40,000 homeless people in New York City. They had a good database system, and so he mined that. 10% were episodically homeless, and 80% were temporarily homeless. As we looked at our data, that basically fell out the same way. We were about 14% were chronically homeless, and about 8 or 9 or 10% were temporarily or episodically homeless. And the bulk of them were temporarily homeless, 30, 60 days into the shelter system and then out. So, and the veterans were about 10 to 12% of our homeless population. So we followed pretty much the national average, and your numbers also follow pretty much the national average, except you do have, in your current count of 2014, a higher percent of chronically homeless that you reported in your point-in-time count.
Right. It was actually up 60%, I think, between 2006 and 2015. And another statistic that we're sharing over there is if you look at homeless per capita among major metros, Portland is 5th highest and Salt Lake is 34th. So we know we have an issue here. We see it every day. So when you looked at those populations, you focused on chronically homeless with the Housing First model. Can you describe for these people what the Housing First model is and how you accomplish that in terms of having sufficient housing for people to go to?
Sure, glad to. So we heard Dr. Samson Barris, who developed this idea of Housing First. And the basic concept of Housing First is, well, let me back up. The old model, the traditional model had been you needed to be clean, dry, and sober before you could get housing. So while you're on the street in this shelter, you would need to get clean, dry, and sober. Then you could get housing. If you fell off the wagon, you lost your housing, your case management. Now that model can work fairly well for those that are temporarily homeless. They have the discipline, basically, that they can do that. However, the chronically homeless have so many barriers, so many mental health issues, 50%, 40 to 50%, substance abuse, 50 to 60%, many of them dual diagnosis. Those barriers are too high. They just can't cope with that. They'll stay on the street. Too many addictions, too many mental health issues. So Dr. Samson Barris in New York had, they did a survey and the homeless asked, they said, what do you need? He said, we need housing. He said, well, we don't do housing, we do treatment. But the homeless people kept saying we need housing. So they took the risk, got some housing under their control, took Sam, and who'd been on the street 20 years mentally ill, and they dealt with the mentally ill folks in New York City, put them into housing, then they wrapped services around them. Now they let Sam continue to drink and use, just like you can drink and use in your apartment, your home. As long as you don't beat up your neighbor or disturb your neighbor, then you can stay there. No one calls the police on you. This was a big risk. 20 years on the street, put him in all by himself, but they had people come over and visit him every day for the first several weeks. And what they found is that 85%, 12 months later, 85% would still be housed. And they began to realize that when the person found out that this was their housing, their stuff would not be stolen, it was safe, they then began to relax and stop self-medicating so much. Alcohol consumption goes way down, drug consumption goes way down. Then they can start to deal with the underlying issues of, trauma in their life, health issues. And so it became quite successful. So they expanded that for a few years, and then they studied it, and then HUD came in and studied it, and comparison groups, everything else, and found it really did work. So it's a whole new model, and it's basically gone international. And so it's called a low barrier, low demand housing. And right off the street, right into housing. And so he had been talking about that, and HUD now was promoting it in the federal government. That was one of the concepts they taught us in May of 2003 in Chicago. Well, we went back and we were writing our plan, so we weren't into that. And there are fortuitous things that happen in life when you have a vision before you and you're moving down that road. I'm a believer in that. And I was at a homeless conference in Las Vegas. I had to leave the conference early, and Samson Barris had been speaking there and heard him speak. I got on the shuttle to go to the airport, and Sam was on there. He and I and one other person from my office were the only ones there. So we met him. That was in May of 2005. We asked him to come out to Utah in June of 2005 to speak to our political leaders and our service providers. And we were then had our plan approved, and we were going to start the process. And we had dedicated some money to do some pilots. Because one of the things we learned, and I've observed, and I've had the opportunity to speak around the country, government has a tendency to do a lot of processing. You get a blue ribbon committee. The mayor appoints it, the governor appoints them. Wonderful high-level power brokers, homeless person thrown in if they can show up, and some advocate. And they write a beautiful report and footnote it and beautify it, pictures, columns, deliver it to the mayor, the governor, a big press conference, and then media goes away, and then the mayor says, who in the hell is going to implement this? Why don't you? And in 2003, 4, 5, and 6, over 400 plans were written, 10-year plans to end chronic homelessness. I'm aware of 2 that have been implemented. 2 that have been implemented. So the process gets in the way. So we realized when you're going to have a change in your culture and a change in your process, we said pilots are the way to go. Low cost, low risk. So we had an option to build on a land to build 100 units, but the housing authority is having a lot of angst and is basically going to back out. I happened to step into a meeting where they were looking at making that decision, and I listened to it, because they were afraid of taking 100 chronic homeless people off the street and putting them into housing. So as I listened, this idea popped into my head that said, okay, let's do a pilot. Let's take 20 chronically homeless people and do a scattered site. We'll take $150,000, which we had set aside for doing pilots, and let's just work with those 20 while we build 100 units. It changed the whole dynamic. Everybody said, yes, we'll do it. Low cost, low risk. And since I'd been reared on a ranch and we had a coal and wood stove, I had the opportunity to chop the wood for the stove, and I learned to chop the big end of the log first. So I said, if we're going to do a chronic homeless pilot, we're going to take the most challenging, difficult, chronically homeless people we can find, and we will house them. Now, the morning we hatched that idea, fortunately, the Housing Authority was having their annual luncheon to recognize their Section 8 voucher landlords. I said, may I come to that luncheon? So I went, introduced myself. We're looking at ending chronic homelessness in 10 years. We're going to do some housing. And so I explained to them we're going to do some chronic homeless housing. And so they had some concerns. Who's going to pay the rent? We're going to master lease. Who's going to do the damage? We'll repair it. What if they have problems? There's going to be a case manager 24/7. You'll call that number. We mitigated all of their questions, then said, how many of you are willing to be part of it? 12 hands went up. Okay, thank you. We'd like you to lower your rent $50 a month, if you're willing. We had the morning we hatched the idea, we had our landlords, we're ready to go. Took us a couple, 3 months to find the 20 or so that we could house, the tough ones. And basically, what I found is we met every 2 weeks to do this process, get identified. We had 20 on the committee, I was chairing it. They kept bringing up all these barriers, and I said, all right, look, in the next meeting in 2 weeks, you tell me what you need to house 5 people by August 1. Oh, we can't do that. Woe is me, and they awfulize. And I said, no, don't tell me what you can't do. You tell me what you need to have 5 people housed by August 1. So they went, and I said, I'll go get it. I will get it. Know what it is, I'll get it. They came back in 2 weeks, and what had happened was they had moved from a barrier orientation to a solution orientation. They said, we can house them. So deadlines, urgency, make it happen. We got 5 housed by August 11th. The remaining ended up being 17 by early part of September. And 22 months later, all 17 were still housed. We became believers. It could be done in Salt Lake City as well as in New York City. Because we have this idea, New York and Washington, D.C. hatches ideas, dump it on the people in the West. So we kind of have an aversion to people in the East. I don't know if that happens here in Portland, but we feel it does in Utah. So we proved to ourselves that it worked. So we've done over 1,400 units, rehab, new construction of housing, because we did a pilot within 2.5 months, made it happen. You don't need to study it for 2 years. Get a pilot going and make it happen now.
Thank you. People here know we're big on process here. I've been to those news conferences that you described. So I want to make sure I understand the initial housing units you found, were those privately owned apartments where the people in them got Section 8 assistance?
These were private. When we went to that luncheon, we had the landlord. These were regular landlords. I'm a landlord. And so yeah, these were like 30, 40 units, and we got 1 unit and maybe 2 units. We'd put the chronically homeless in there. So these, for that 22-month period, these were just regular landlords.
So you were working one-on-one with landlords
Yes,
to make
absolutely.
it work. And then when you...
the care and feeding of landlords is very important.
I've been a landlord, I'll agree with you about
Absolutely.
that.
So don't screw around with that. Take care of them. I mean, you get that case managed. So we were very diligent in making sure those needs got met because they're a very important part of this solution.
And then the 1,400 units you developed, are those publicly owned housing or are they a mix?
They're owned by the housing authority or the shelter.
Okay.
Very important. The housing authorities owning them and building them or rehabbing them because they and the housing, I don't know if the housing authority folks are here, but they're a very important part because project-based Section 8 vouchers becomes critically important in order to make these facilities cash flow. So our 2 largest housing authorities were willing to project-based Section 8s, so the Section 8 voucher stays with the unit, doesn't go with the tenant. And so they own those, and they will screen people in. So 65% of our chronic homeless have a criminal history. Landlords, that's an issue. Housing authority, it's not an issue because they know that's the targeted market.
Right.
So we don't have that problem. Now, long-term sex offenders, there's 3 things HUD does. Long-term sex offenders, production of meth in public housing, and violent criminals are not allowed to be in Section 8 housing or public housing. That's all. Anything else other than that is local policy. Our housing authorities came to the table willing to participate, so having them own those facilities and manage those facilities really makes it a lot easier.
Right. When we did our 10-year plan to end homelessness, which I think was done with a lot of really good intention and good thinking.
Sure, it's good intention,
absolutely
no question,
great
not
leaders,
the intent.
But it's hard, it's very hard. We focused on long-term housing, and this community moved away from shelters, and we actually today have fewer shelter beds than we did before the recession. So I'm interested, we looked at the statistics, 8% of the beds available for homeless in Portland are emergency shelters, 23% in Salt Lake are emergency shelters. How do you see shelter beds, emergency beds being part of this equation?
They're a very important part. In the beginning of the 10-year planning process in 2003 and 4, there were some words said, published, that we will eliminate the need for shelters. Well, we saw that that was not a good set of assumptions. Shelters are absolutely crucial. They're an entry door. They're an engagement process. We will always need emergency shelters, but they need to be emergency shelters, not long-term stay places. No longer than 30 days there. And that doesn't mean you evict them. That means you get them into housing, 30, 35 days. So we will always need emergency shelters. Too many personal choices. Too many drugs out there. I mean, some of you in this room may have been homeless. I was speaking to a group of 350 people recently and made the comment, and some of you in this room may become homeless in 5 years because you get hooked on drugs, alcohol, or whatever, and you lose your job, everything else. So, let's not think that that's not a possibility for many of us. So emergency shelters are very important. And nobody needs to sleep on the street. We have empty beds in our shelter system. No one is turned away. No one is turned away. Even if we put up cots in the conference room and in the hallways, no family needs to sleep on the street.
Here,
we have that capacity.
We agree with you about that. So when you put people into the housing, and I love that your approach, you took the worst of the worst, the people who had the greatest need, put them in housing. Did you then provide services, support services to them there to help them through with addictions or employment or whatever else they may have needed?
Absolutely. Housing first is that they will have supportive services. So it's permanent supportive housing. It's permanent with supports, case management. Now, it's difficult to build affordable housing, no question, but a whole lot easier than getting the ongoing supportive services. The state of Utah has a homeless trust fund. That came about in 1988 when legislation was passed to create a tax checkoff. So when you paid your state taxes, you can make a donation to the homeless trust fund. Now, when that was put on there were 2 opportunities. Now there's like 18. There's Happy Ducks and organ donations and you name it. Everybody said that's where we can get money. Well, it's diluted it down to where the Homeless Trust Fund only gets about $60,000. But the mechanism was put into place. So as that dropped down, general funds from the state goes into the Homeless Trust Fund, which is about $4.5 to $5 million. A homeless trust fund that's focused on homeless, and it's fairly flexible. There's a committee, and as long as it allocates, and I've been on that committee for 20 years, as long as it's dealing with homelessness, then you can use those funds, less restrictive than the federal dollars. So we committed these state homeless trust funds to provide the services, because you do not want to put Sam, 20 years mental health on the street, into a unit and leave him alone. That's the disaster. So, but some people are calling it housing first, putting him in housing and not providing the services. So it's absolutely crucial and vital that when you start building permanent supportive housing or housing first model, you have the money for the services, because they need that kind of support. And when they're ready, then you link them up with treatment. And after about a year or so, a lot of our folks said, I want some income, I want some additional income. Then they're ready to get employed. And we're always asking them, okay, our goal is everyone will increase their income through employment. It may take 3 years, but our vision is everyone will increase income through employment. That may be 5 hours a week at minimum wage, but it's still increasing income through employment. Work is therapeutic, it's very countable. And the people in our, and I say this to every reporter, that they pay rent, 30% of their income, or $50, whichever is greater. These residents pay rent. There's accountability with this. It's not a free gift. But you also need to deal with them where they are. So don't require them to give up their smoking or their drinking or their drug use to keep their housing. That's fundamental. I'm the person, it's not a right, but it's a fundamental opportunity that we as a community can give to them, but they need the services in order to navigate the bureaucratic system, the employment system, the mainstream resource system, and everything else. So that case manager is absolutely crucial.
I'm interested in the model and who you brought to the table to work with you on this, because it's obviously a very difficult issue. We have a lot of our partners in social service agencies in the room here, a lot of government. First question I have is, you were with the state, so the state was taking the lead on this. Here, the state is engaged, but it's sort of in a behind-the-scenes role, and it's the local agencies who are front line. How did it work differently to have the state in the lead role in Utah?
Well, I think it was very important. So yes, I was loaned to the state, and so it became important as I went around the state, because it was a statewide effort, to say I'm Lieutenant Governor, Chair of the State Homeless Coordinating Committee. And we made that change because this committee had been operating since 1988, and I'd been on it. There's a bunch of service providers allocating the Homeless Trust Fund. When we started the 10-year plan, we went back to the governor and said, this needs to become a policy committee. So we want you to have your Lieutenant Governor chair it, and your cabinet level people to sit on it. She said, okay. So she sent out an email and made it happen. We're on our 4th Lieutenant Governor, who chairs the committee, and every time a Lieutenant Governor comes in, we put him in a car, and we drive him around, and he meets the homeless people, he meets the homeless service providers, and gets the feel for his responsibilities. So you always continue to educate your political leaders. So the state had the funding, allocated the funding, and I was loaned to the state. It made a whole lot of difference to be able to go out and say, I'm representing the governor's office. Now, only twice did I have to have the governor or lieutenant governor sign an email or a letter and send it out to say, yeah, Lloyd's representing us. Only twice in 12, 13 years, because they pretty well knew and believed it. And he always came and spoke at our homeless summit every year. Always delivered the keynote address. I would write his talking points. He didn't always follow them, but he was there. Which was him being there and saying, yo, thank you, keep up the good work, we support you. Very important. But at the same time, I also realized and we learned these local homeless coordinating committees around the state, we asked and required that an elected official chair it. Because I had observed over the years that if you do not have an elected official at the table beating the drum, leading the charge, you're in trouble. You just don't get the traction that you need. So we made a political leader, and I'd have to go find one who would be willing to take it on, educate them, support them, coach them, mentor them, which I did. It was a lot of windshield time. One of the meetings was 6 hours to the four corners, one way. I'll go to that meeting every month. I'd hit 3 on that trip. So we brought in the governor's office, the mayors of major cities, county commissioners, mayors of counties, homeless service providers. So we brought them all together. So the city, the county, and the state, and the service providers, businesses, etc., were all in the discussion. We created one vision. We're all towards that one vision, consistent message for 13 years to everybody, and so we rallied around that one vision. Now, did everybody agree? Did we have to make tough decisions? Was there weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth when we took money away from agencies and repurposed the funds? Absolutely. But those tough decisions needed to be made. So we call it centrally led but locally developed. Centrally led but locally developed. And as I've gone around the country, they say, and I had Bill Hobson from Seattle up here, who was one of the people who went to see how you do this. He would come down and say, he said, I would kill for the collaboration you have in your area, the support you have. He said, we're fragmented up in King County. We do a lot of good work, but we're fragmented. So having that central common vision and everybody aligned and rowing in the same direction is basically the reason that we got where we got, and we have champions. Champions who bought into this idea, and I happen to be fortunate to be one of the champions to convey the message. So if I were to come to here, I get a lot of idea of how you kind of politically organize. I would change all of that. Take Joe over here, or Debbie, wherever she is. Debbie runs part of Portland, I understand.
Most of Portland, actually.
And put her in charge and say, all right, we're going to bring everybody together and we're going to have one drumbeat and we're going to make it happen. My observation is until you do that and put somebody in charge who has the monkey and you start doing pilots, you make it happen, you don't do the process, I mean, you need some process, then you can start rallying the resources. You're a wealthy community, you're a wealthy state. You can make it happen. Look, we're a poor state compared to you. You have a ton of money, and I did some analysis. You have a lot of money. Now, you think you're poor. Now, Henry Ford said, if you think you can or you think you can't, you're right.
How about the role of the business community?
Very important, especially the banks. Wells Fargo, stand up, take a bow.
Tracy Curtis.
KeyBank. And KeyBank. Very important.
We love them both.
Other banks take up a very important part of the process. They're on our state homeless coordinating committee, some of the banks. The CRA money is absolutely vital, buying the tax credits. And we went to our tax credit organization, and they gave extra points if you were building permanent supportive housing so you could compete with the for-profit developers. So we could bring on 100 units in 2007, 84 units in 2008, 201 units in 2009, another 110 units in 2010, another 72 units, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we got them to repurpose some of their funds to meet this need. So it's crucial the business community becomes part of this because your impact, especially downtown businesses, and you see the urgency of it, and you get, I'm just guessing, may not be here, but I'm just guessing, you're frustrated with the slow process of government. You want something to happen now. So that's why the importance of pilots. You just take 20. You will learn with taking 20 and using the new model 80% of what you need to know. You don't need 200. Just do 20. You'll learn the process. Then you can ramp it up once you work out your bugs. And it's low cost, low risk, but you will learn a ton.
I want to do one paid political announcement. We're concerned about the future of the housing tax credits in Oregon because of a potential ballot measure that we have. So it's really important that we hold on to those so we can build this housing.
Absolutely.
So we're very concerned about that. Okay. I mentioned to Lloyd earlier, in a past life, I had the opportunity to spend a lot of time in Utah. And one of the things I came to respect was the role of the church, of the Mormon church in Utah. And so I'm interested in the role that the church played in your effort and how you see the engagement of faith communities in places like Portland as we do our outreach as well.
Okay, faith groups are very important, very vital. As you all know, it's part of the theology to reach out to those that are suffering and need, whether you're a Christian, a Muslim, Judaic, Eastern religion. Look, that theology is the same. We care for one another. We reach out. That's our opportunity. That's our service to one another. So yes, that's very important. So the churches are very involved. Yes, Ernest Stein, the LDS Church, that's the 500-pound gorilla in Utah, no question. 60% of the state, 65, Salt Lake City is about 50% LDS. The rest of the state's about 70%. So it's a strong element there, and there is the welfare program for this church, LDS Church, storehouses, farms, ranches, canneries, processing plant. So you can get a bishop's order if you have a need, and so there is that whole process there. Those resources have tapped into. So food is given to the shelters. People move into a unit, moving kits put together. The churches volunteer, all churches volunteer, Eagle Scout projects to do moving kits, cleaning kits, food kits. You're coming off the street. I got loaned out from the LDS Church. They paid for my salary. I was still doing my job at the church and doing this in addition. So they didn't lose anything. I still did my job well. And also they put some cash in. But a couple of really important elements which you can tap into here to a certain degree. There's a Desert Industry thrift store, and you have them here in Portland. You may not be aware of it. But we set up a program, and I happened to be involved in setting this up when I worked for the church, so it was and I was up here to implement this program 18 years ago. When a family moves off the street or out of a shelter into housing, they don't have much. So the furnishings, the clothing, the dishes, all of that. So you can get a Desert Industry voucher. So the nonprofits, the shelter, have an opportunity to write a voucher, and the family can go to the Desert Industry and get those items in order to set up a home. When we built these 1,400 units, brought them online, the LDS Church also produces mattresses and beds, furnishings, dressers, bureaus, kitchen tables, chairs. They then would donate all of that to set up the furnishings in those units. And when the family or individual would move out and take that with them, then they would backfill that unit again with a new mattress, furnishings, etc. That's hundreds of, big chunk of money. So that allowed us then for families to move out much more successfully, less stressfully, because they had that opportunity to access these resources. You can do the same thing with Goodwill, Salvation Army, the Desert Industry. If I were to come back here, I'd link you up with the folks who run that, with the nonprofits. That's a resource you can tap into. So that became a very important part of drilling down and meeting these deeper needs as you move people off the street, through the shelter, or right into housing. So that became a very important part.
We, as I mentioned, we had a particularly difficult summer with the travelers this year, who I think are the primary source of the calls for complaints that the city gets and we get through our Clean and Safe program: illegal drug use, camping, unregulated camping. There was a term used this summer, which I didn't agree with, compassion fatigue in Portland. I think Portlanders are very compassionate. How did you guys deal with those behaviors as civility issues in Salt Lake and the rest of Utah as you dealt with this, what we see on our sidewalks and under our bridges?
A couple of things. One, about 25% of the homeless population are from out of state. And everywhere you go, I'm sure somebody said it here, if we do nice, wonderful services, guess what? More will show up. Right. If you build it, they will come mentality. We basically said, get over that, folks in Utah. 25% travel. We call them hobos when I was a kid. They ride the rails, That's out of vogue term, I understand, but that's what we looked at. So that's just part of the process. And also, people come to Utah because there's been a very good economy. Even during the recession, our unemployment rate was 2.5 to 3 percentage points below the national unemployment rate. Right now, we're the #1 economy, that Forbes said, in growing business and everything else. People show up there because they hear about job opportunities. They arrive on fumes, a lot of the families, and so things don't work out. They end up in the shelter for a while. That's just part of the process, so we don't worry about that. We know it's about 25%. So that's just accepted. We also know people move from Utah and go to Portland or to Arizona. I don't know if they come to Portland, but Arizona and Las Vegas, there's kind of a circuit there in Utah. We know that. So we don't worry about that. They're part of our homeless citizenry. They're there. We don't want to ignore them, so we include them. One of the things, that 91%, that's wonderful, and our homeless veterans, wonderful. Our overall homeless numbers have not gone down that much. Because as you've seen, during the recession, we had over a 300% increase in family homelessness. Huge increase. So there's a structural issue in the country. The middle class was shrinking. So, there's 4 things that deal with poverty. There's structural, there's personal choices, there's local policies, everything else. So we're dealing with, we're not trying to solve poverty. We're getting people housed and stably housed. If you're trying to take on poverty, that's way too much. So, and this is the safety net. So if you were to walk downtown Salt Lake, and the drug issue has increased, spice has really, in the last couple of years, has really increased, and the drug activity. So if you were to walk downtown Salt Lake, around the homeless shelter, we have a lot of co-located services. You see a lot of people there because the soup kitchen's there, the drop-in center's there, the shelter's there, medical clinic is a block or 2 away. So you would say, wow, what's Utah saying about this reduction? Well, it's chronic homeless. And what we have, a lot of drug dealers come in and mingle with the homeless people. So there's a lot of, they're not all homeless that are there milling around that area. So the city is looking at potentially relocating the shelter because that part of the city is being gentrified. It's the intermodal hub, the heavy rail and the light rail. So, and a big 25-acre mall opened up before the Olympics, right across the street from the shelter. So there's pressure, and we'll probably relocate the shelter and not co-locate so many services, spread them out a little bit more. So, what we're able to do, because we had people who are chronically homeless, been in the shelter 400 days on average, 600, 700 days on average, we took them out and put them in housing. When you take a chronically homeless person out of your shelter, you can put 10 people in that same bed over the next 12 months. So because we had taken out hundreds of chronically homeless people, long-term stayers out of the shelter system, we were able to absorb this huge increase in families. We converted beds to family beds. And we took the time in the shelter from 66 days down to 33 days and working to get to 30 days. So it truly is an emergency shelter. And there are empty beds. No one needs to sleep on the street. So we saw an immediate return by taking these long-term stayers out into housing, freeing up the beds for emergency situations. So now the goal is family homelessness by 2020 and youth homeless by 2020. That it's down to where basically any stay, any homeless situation is very short term. And we're almost there on families because in 30 days they're pretty well out and into housing. Rapid rehousing. There's different interventions for different segments of the population. We're really good at rapid rehousing. A lot of people come in and take a look at it and studied it because we developed that model and picked it up and really grew it. So, yeah, they're the transients. They're going to come. Don't get caught up and worried about it because we can't do anything about it other than just deal with them when they're here. So it's just part of the process.
Right. I think we want to open it up for some questions from the audience. Treasurer Wheeler was going to ask the first question.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Pendleton, thank you for coming here and sharing your experience with us today.
I was just flying by and said there's going to be a meeting here, so I just thought I'd show up.
Well,
thank you for the invitation.
We do serve the best coffee in the country for meetings.
I don't drink coffee, so that doesn't work for me. Try again.
That wasn't the right thing, Ted.
Next question.
You know, you're the guest, so I'm just going to ignore that and move right along. So I wanted to get back to this question that you did address, but I'm hoping we can dig a little bit deeper. You mentioned process, and there's sort of a joke in our community that there's no good idea that can't be processed to death. And it also gets to this question of the siloed nature. We have our state, we have our county, we have our city, we have our metro regional government, we have a myriad of agencies, nonprofit organizations, and we have other interested parties like the business community represented here today. Did you experience the siloed nature, and did you experience turf battles, and did you experience established cultures? In other words, this is how we do business here. How did you break down those silos? How did you break down those barriers? How did you overcome some of that bureaucratic inertia and the business as usual attitudes that probably prevailed in some of those organizations? Did that committee that you chaired or that you were part of, did that in and of itself do it, or was there more that we should be looking at as we try to address these problems collectively here in our community and in our state?
I like that question since I fed it to you. That's great. No. No, that is true. We did not have the siloization that I think you're having here. We have a strong mayor system. The county mayor is strong, elected. The city mayor is strong. And also within the culture, we are already collaborative. And we've been fairly collaborative before we started the 10-year planning process. There were some silos, and when we came together, I found it, and as I went around the state and created 12 local committees, what I found quite fascinating, when we got everybody in the room that had a dog in the fight or skin in the game, including the schools, the police, the sheriff, the state employees out there, in a town of 10,000 people, they'd come together and say, what is it you do? What are your services? When we started that process. Even in those small communities, they knew one another, but I was surprised at how often they say, oh, you provide that service? I didn't know that. You provide that service? I didn't know that. I would say, wait, this is 10,000 people in this whole city or county, and you didn't know that. So bringing them together and having that face-to-face dialogue at the beginning 10, 12 years ago broadened the collaboration, deepened the collaboration, and de-siloed, or more importantly, I think, made them aware of what others were doing and the services so they could refer. So then we began to coordinate the services much more effectively in order to meet those needs. So, and given that I was coming from the state and leading it, it added another dimension. So, and my style is pretty, I might say confrontational, but I'm willing to call people and to say, all right, okay, that's an interesting view now. If you were in this seat, sometimes I'd actually get up and go over and sit in their seat and put them in my seat as the chair and say, all right, how would you deal with it? And have them look at it from a different perspective. Actually physically moving into a different seat to facilitate the discussion and the perspective building so that they could begin to say, oh, okay. Because many times you grow up in your system and you view the world from that belief window that you have, and you can't see it from the other people's perspective. So there was a lot of that facilitation, but basically there was a good civil approach. There are a couple of organizations that rained on us, and they have a shrill voice. They have an important message, but how they deliver it, they get up on the steps of the Capitol and call a press conference and yell at the legislatures and tell them they're wicked, evil, mean, nasty, and bad. They don't put enough money into solve poverty. And so they rain on their parade. They basically get ignored. So there's a couple of those that basically did not join the discussion, but most did and became part of the solution. And the other thing is, we created champions, and so I was always looking for champions, and there are certain characteristics of champions. Locally, within each segment, who's going to pick up and take that? Who's going to do the housing? Who's going to do the services? Who's going to do this? And get champions and nurture them, coach them, mentor them, so that they would take over. I basically worked myself out of a job. So when I left in June, nobody replaced me. The whole system was owned and being operated by the structure because I was on a lily pad. Nobody reported to me. I had no money. So for 9 years, when I was actually at the state, I basically facilitated and helped them catch the new vision, implement the system, so that when I stepped out, it's just going, they're not even missing me. That, to me, is a successful operation.
Absolutely. I think Debbie has a question.
Debbie!
Hi. Well, thank you so much for your comments today, and I think you provide a good model that we can try to emulate here in our community, especially the collaboration and working together to try to find solutions to this issue. But one of the issues that we have been concerned about a lot is the camping. There's unorganized camping that's happening throughout the Central City area. But then there's also some organized camps, and part of the process that's being developed is the question of whether there should be organized tent camps for providing housing and safety off the streets, safe places for people to sleep if we don't have enough shelter beds. What has your approach been in Utah regarding that, and was that an option that was considered?
That was not an option considered because we had enough shelter beds, and as we took the chronically homeless out, opened up more shelter beds. So we've always had the shelter. And one policy change that was made in our largest shelter, they could stay for 90 days and they had to go out. You know, there was, a few years ago, there was a line to get in, but as we've taken those out, then there's no line. But what they found was that the people would come in and leave their stuff on their bunk bed, and they wouldn't show up for several nights, could go stay with somebody else, sleep out on the street, whatever. So there was a major policy shift in that they basically said, each day you come into the shelter, you need to leave. And, you know, that was, you know, kind of changed the system. But because there would be 90 to 100 beds that would be vacant with just stuff sitting on there. So when they made that policy change, they had to come back in, and as we took more of the chronic homeless out, there were enough shelter beds, so no one's turned away now. So we did make some policy changes from that standpoint. So there are camps on the Jordan River, and the health people go in and kind of clean them up because it's a health issue. But there are not a lot of camps. There's no big camps. And you don't see them. You have to go find them because they're down in the bushes, out in there else. And you know, now outreach workers know where they are, and I've gone out to some of them. So it's pretty limited. So when I see the camps here or in various other places, it's like, wow. I mean, that's a bigger issue that we really didn't have to deal with because our model is go out and bring them into the shelter, and many don't want to come in because last night there were 900 people in our shelter, the largest shelter. Families, women, and men all have different entrances, but that's a pretty big congregation. So when we change the shelter, we're going to move the families off to a separate shelter and then have our singles. I mean, that is not a good model, but that's one that started back in the early 80s. So camp-wise, if I were going to take a look at it, part of it is I would say, all right, the answer is housing or shelters. So if you've declared an emergency, you need shelter beds. That's part of it because then you have access to them. You can begin to engage them and work with them in order to get them into housing. So if you've got families, and I assume most of these are not families, these are single individuals camping out here. So you can rapidly rehouse them. So it really becomes a concerted effort in order to how are we going to get these people housing opportunities? That's the answer. So how do you marshal your resources, bring together the business, the housing authorities, and start putting them into housing? So start a pilot. We're going to get 25 of these into housing in 4 months. And Debbie, you're in charge.
Debbie could do it.
and you're going to pull the people who have the resources together, and you're going to get 25 people in housing, and you're going to get the county and the city and the state in your committee, and you're going to say, look, we're going to come together. I understand you're a little dysfunctional politically, how you organize, so you're going to have to work around that. But basically, I have observed you're going to need to put somebody in charge. You have the monkey, and the political leaders have your back, and you're going to make it happen, and you're going to make tough decisions. Because when we start, anyway, I could go on, but so housing is the answer.
Liza? Please.
Mr. Pendleton, thank you for coming to Portland. My name's Stuart Emmons. I have a question about the mortgage banking industry.
Mortgage banking?
Yes.
I'm not very well informed on that.
Well, let me give it a try. I'm sure you might have some comments on this. In the recession, we had a lot of good people who lost their jobs or fell on hard times and couldn't make payments and were at risk of being foreclosed on. And now our state has come up with some programs. But is there a way that the state of Utah worked with other agencies to slow the rate of foreclosures and during the recession and after?
Yes, sir. There was the HUD that came out, and there were agencies that were, contracted to go out and do the training, working with, and so we put all that in place. We had a fairly high foreclosure rate for a period of time, and that's part of what dumped some of these, or moved the families into the homeless situation. I'm sorry, dump doesn't sound very sophisticated, does it? I'm a cowboy off the West Desert, so forgive me, please. She shuddered. But brought these families into the homeless, and so we had this huge increase in family homelessness, which part of it was the recession. And there's been a delayed impact, we see, because they move with relatives, move with relatives, move with relatives. They burned all the bridges, and they end up in the shelters. So we see a 2 or 3 year delay sometimes before they show up. So yes, we did something. How effective it was compared with other states, I can't comment on that knowledgeably.
Yes. Hi.
Good morning. My name is Jess Larson, and I'm the director of the Welcome Home Coalition. I can't thank you enough to Sandy and the Portland Business Alliance for convening this room of champions for this issue, and Dr. Pendleton for being here with us today. I can say firsthand that the way you've laid out the how-to, the steps to solving homelessness is exactly what I was doing for 10 years on the front lines of the housing crisis here in Portland with kitchen kits and housing supplies from our community warehouse and visits to folks to keep them stable in their housing. And my question for you is, how do we in Portland deal with the very real and different problem of a lack of housing? We have rent assistance, we have an infrastructure, we have an entire community behind a strategy to end homelessness with our A Home for Everyone committee. We're all on the same page. And what we also have is a less than or hovering around 2% vacancy rate. And we have vouchers that we can't find housing to place people in to end homelessness with. So how can you inform us from your experience or from other cities around the country about how to address homelessness when homelessness is growing because of our very housing crisis?
Okay, 2 things. 1, you need to build more affordable housing and permanent supportive housing. That's why we built 1,400 units. We have 300 or 400 units that are scattered site using, working with landlords. So, but that's 2 years before you get the next, the ribbon cutting. So our vacancy rate's 2% also, currently. Our homeless shelter, who has been tasked with, and we've centralized that, so any homeless family that any agency deals with goes to the road home homeless shelter. They have the funding, the contract to process, rapidly rehouse. They have 3 housing navigators. They have over 900 landlords with whom they work. The vacancy rate basically is determined on the large apartment complexes. So you have a lot of mom and pop, like me, rental units. Basement here, house, duplex here, duplex there. Those don't necessarily get counted into the vacancy rate. So you basically have to, the care and feeding of those landlords and nurturing, and most of them, if they realize they're going to be protected, get their rent, damage taken care of, you have a case manager that can deal with the social issues. Many of them, out of the goodness of their heart, want to reach out and be of assistance. But when they can do that within a structure that supports them, they can see that they're actually contributing. So going out and having those housing locators and going out and finding those landlords, getting those references, and nurturing them, then when these homeless people come in, then they can work with them and move them into that. So you still can do it even at a 2% vacancy rate. So I'm just saying is, don't cop out on, well, the vacancy rate is 2%, we can't do anything. No, you can.
Real quickly before I let Mitch come up, how did you finance your affordable housing, and how did you control the per unit cost? Because that's one issue we've had here, that some of our affordable housing has been very expensive on a per unit basis.
Well, tax credits, as I mentioned earlier, became the key piece. So, we got additional points in competing for the tax credit application annually. So the housing authorities went in, and they knew how to do it. They'd been doing it before, so they were good candidates to do the building. And the homeless shelter bought this Holiday Inn. So converted holiday or motels. It's a quicker way to turn. You just put a little kitchenette in there. So tax credits became key. Then home money, CDBG money, state money, state home money and county home money, and general fund money. So all of that becomes part of the process of affording. And when we built those initially, it's $110 a unit, $110,000 a unit. It's up now, obviously, and I haven't been that close to the construction. It's probably $150,000, $145,000 a unit now. They're 380 square feet. The Holiday Inn, 201 rooms. It's a room. It's a old motel room. Little kitchenette on the back of the bathroom wall. Little closet, bathroom. That's our permanent supportive housing. So you can keep the cost down from that standpoint. So yeah, we can do, and yeah, wherever you go, the land policies, get the land donated. City, county, churches, some business can donate land. So some of the land was donated from that standpoint. So we work diligently to keep the cost down.
Well, it kills me, but we could go on for another hour, but we're going to have to tie it up. Lloyd, can't thank you enough for coming and sharing your experiences. We have a gift for you. It's from a long-time Portland company, Pendleton Woolen Mills. And
yes, it's a bag.
Now, not just because of the name, but there's a great thing going on. Pendleton is working with Human Solutions, so if you bring a new or gently used blanket into a participating Pendleton Woolen Mills store, they'll give you 20% off on your purchases. So we thought it was a great connection for today's discussion. Let's give Lloyd another hand. Well, Portland's at an inflection point, clearly. I bet I'm a lot like a lot of people in this room. 29 years ago, I got involved with a program that provides services to homeless youth. And that 29 years has been frustrating, rewarding, it's complex, and sometimes you feel like you've done all you can do and it's time to walk away and let somebody else try. But I'd like to challenge the room to ask the question that Lloyd asked himself in that plane ride from Chicago to Salt Lake. If it can be done in New York or Salt Lake, by God, we ought to be able to do it here in Portland, Oregon. So keep your energy, keep focused, and keep your ears to the ground, because there's a lot of good stuff going on, and it's going to take the collective energy and efforts of this room to make it happen. I'd like to do a little bit of business, call attention to our membership referral drive on your table. If you know of any business that ought to be here, please pass that name on, and we're going to have a drawing at the end of the year, and Alaska will provide you a couple of tickets anywhere they fly if you're drawn. If you like what you heard today, next month we'll have another forum. We're going to be talking about those business acquisitions that have arrived in Portland and are benefiting our regional economy. I'd like to one more time thank Pamplin, Media Group, Liberty Mutual, and KeyBank, and we're adjourned. Thanks for coming.